Okay, now I'm going to start recording and I'll start again. Welcome everybody to the Talking Talmud Siyum for Masechet Rosh Hashanah, our 9th Siyum together. Thank you everybody for joining us today on this Sunday morning. We will get started with our friend Beth, who's going to start by sharing some words of Torah with us. Beth, I don't see you. Are you there? Okay, so we will then start with Leanne. If Leanne is there, she can share her poem with us.
Okay. Good morning, Boker Tov, and let's start. The Mishnah asks, they light the torches during that earlier period. They would bring items that burn well, long poles of cedar, reeds, pine wood, and beaten flax, and tie them together with a string. And then someone would ascend to the top of the mountain and light the torch on fire with them and wave it back and forth up and down until he would see his colleague doing likewise at the top of the second mountain. One of the many topics covered in this Masechet I chose to write about for this morning. I have written a poem about the witnesses up looking for the new moon. And I know that all of us are doing this together, and I hope that we can all feel the way that the witnesses did as they sat on top of those hills. So this is called the Prayer of the Witnesses. We sit alone, our faces turned toward the sky, deep velvet blue darkness pierced with endless stars, silence broken only by the call of an owl. A light breeze travels by on its way to Yerushalayim, carrying with it the golden dust of the hills. Ribono shel olam, teach us to see through the darkness, to search for the small, the most insignificant, the barest hint of a moon shyly rising on the horizon. Enable us to gaze at the night sky, to trust our vision, to see the potential of the molad, for a new moon is all potential, of good tidings, of good health, in its modest beginnings. Ribono shel olam, give us patience to watch, although we may be weary, our eyes heavy. Grant us the knowledge that a sliver of light so distant can bring order to our lives. Teach us the ability to discern between light and darkness, ben or lechoshech, so that we may be accurate in our vision. Ribono shel olam, we are but the smallest specks of dust in this sky which goes on forever, perched on this hill in the stillness of night, players in the unfolding drama of the movement of the universe. Open our eyes to perceive through the darkness, to capture the light of the new moon. The breeze has reached Yerushalayim. The owl has stopped its show. The dew is settling on our cloaks, and there is silence in the hills. Our wide eyes lift to the sky, searching, seeking, and the doors to the sky open just a crack to reveal the Levana, the Molad. We peer through the darkness at the thinnest of crescents, veiled in a yellow haze, and our hearts skip a beat. We reach for pine and cedar and reeds with trembling fingers, and we light our torches. The crackling blaze illuminates our faces, just as the Molad is illuminated with modesty, with beauty. It lights the way to a new month, to a new year. And that's it.
Like how you said, that's it. I was very moved by this poem personally. I got a little bit of a sneak peek. And I love the idea of how Rosh Chodesh is really an opportunity for renewal on each and every month. And the idea that as humans, really the act of being Mekadesh the Chodesh is one of having to really look for something that's very, that's very far away and that we can't necessarily see. If everyone can just mute themselves. So now we're going to call on Beth Kislev to share some words of Torah. I'm just going to unpin you. And Leanne, you have a month till the next one. So but thank you so much. We love your poems and we're so moved by them always.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you were expecting me to speak or not. So, I mean, I have something I thought about. So, yeah, so I was thinking about, what is so moving in this Masechet, and it's really about the passage of time. And I just want to dedicate this to a young woman named Minna Leora. She was born last Sunday, and I introduced her parents to each other 3 years ago. So it's very exciting for me to be aware of the passage of time in this way and see new people around. Her father has been doing Daf Yomi. So I went over the other day and I, just brought them something. And, I said, well, she is much closer to knowledge of everything because, the whole Torah and the woman, she's only, a few days out. He said, yeah, I do the Daf and I hold her and I ask her, what do you think? What do you think? Can you help me with this? And I just, I hope there are more people in the world whose parents will ask them what they think as time passes. So that was just my preliminary words. So I was thinking about, which parts of this Masechet were most moving. Is it when we learn that when the shofar is blown, it's as though we ourselves have bound ourselves on the Akedah? Is it that when we blow the shofar, we confuse Satan on page 16b? Is it, that God's self is wrapped in a prayer shawl and praise? Or I was really fascinated by this idea that diving for coral, you could go out to the middle of the ocean and put sand in your boat and sink the entire ship and then come back up. That just seems so fascinating how they could access this completely different world. And I guess maybe that's what Rosh Hashanah is really about, is this through sanctifying time we're accessing different worlds as well. But the thing I wanted to focus on was page 31a, this idea that the Shekhinah travels on 10 journeys with us, and that it's derived from different verses, but that there's this gradual sense as we're exiled that the Shekhinah goes with us. And I think in this time when time passes very slowly, all of our usual activities are not available to us in this pandemic time. That the place, I was reading a Dvar Torah yesterday about Yaakov and Hamakom, and this sense that the name of God as a place is, the idea is that God is a place that we can access, and that to restore us to ourselves, we have to somehow come back to the place, so that when this Shekhinah goes with us slowly accompanying us in the exile, it's as though there's still part of ourselves. We haven't totally lost ourselves in exile. We can still get back to this place, that it's a gradual process. And I think that I was reading the book review this morning. There's a new book called On Consolation. And I'm feeling that, really this Masechet and being able to study Daf Yomi itself is a kind of consolation for all these difficult things that have happened. The text itself is still this possibility of returning ourselves to the place that even though we're in exile, we still, if we can't go back to the place, we still have a way to talk about it and to know that there's this sense of a divine presence with us. So I really feel that even in these difficult times, Daf Yomi is a form of consolation. So thank you.
Thank you, Beth. We really appreciate that. I think for many of us here, having started this Masechet having started Daf Yomi 2 months before our entire world changed. I think for many of us, like you say, this was like a gift of consolation and of keeping some sort of regularity to what seemed totally irregular. So thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, and now I would like to call upon our our guest speaker today, Tom Rosenfeld. Anne stepped away for 2 minutes. She was going to introduce him. But Tom is, oh, there you are, Anne. If you can, if you want to introduce our special speaker.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I have known Tom since, I would say, more than 10 years, believe it or not. We used to work together. Tom works in high tech, and he was our local resident astronomer. He called it an astronomy hobby. It seems a lot more than that to those of us who might like the idea of the sky and don't really know much about it. Tom knows a great deal about it. Tom, you could say more, but I know you said also that you're a member of the New Moon Club, and is that what it's called? And that there is a group of people who look and scout the new moon. Even now, when we have the calendar, al pi cheshbon, we do the math for it, but there are still people now who go out and look for the new moon as per everything, Tom, you're about to tell us. So I think we'd like to dive right in.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Can all hear me, I guess, right? Okay, so yeah, like Anne said, I have a hobby of astronomy. I like to go outside and look at the sky, and I'll send you all a link a little bit later, but as in the Masechet Rosh Hashanah, there's still people today that do research on the first visibility of the new moon. There's a group here in Israel and actually all over the world where people send emails once a month when they see the new moon. Let me share my screen and I can start to show you some of these things. Okay. So there's a Blogspot page. Oops. Where you can sign up for email and they will send you an email similar to this, where they tell you for the coming month. Actually, this was the new moon that just passed on last Shabbat, and they tell you where to look and when to look and how to look. And then later on, they send you a report of who saw the moon and what time it was, and when was the earliest visibility of the new moon. And again, we can send you some more information about that. But anyhow, so I wanted to say just a few words. We had some nice introductions before me that were, speaking of the spirituality of the new moon. And I'm going to get down a little bit more down to earth on the new moon, or actually up to the moon about the moon. So the first question is, when learning, it's one thing to learn the halachot and the Gemara, and also, as you've probably learned nowadays, we don't, use the witnesses method. We have a slightly different method that's based on calculation. So a lot of people don't really understand, what's the big deal about sighting the new moon? Probably all of you have been outside on some evening this month or last month or sometime, and you saw the moon. It's big and bright, and even from cities with a lot of light pollution, you can usually see the moon. So what's the big deal? I want to show you, here's a couple of pictures that were taken by photographers that were better than I. And this is actually the new moon from this month of Kislev. And if you have a nice camera and you know where to look, so you can get a pretty nice picture of the new moon. So to see a moon like this is a little bit trickier because it's not this big white thing. It's just a tiny little crescent. And if you're going to see the moon at the very beginning of the month, as we'll explain in a few minutes, usually you have to look at it when the sky is not completely dark yet. It's just getting dark. It's right after sunset. So you can see the background here is not black, it's kind of hazy. And so this gives you a little more context for what you're seeing. The sun's below the horizon, the sky is this beautiful red and orange. And you've got to kind of know where to look and be ready to look, because in a few more minutes, the moon is going to set. And also notice that as it gets lower down, it's getting into a part of the sky that's got more clouds and more water vapor. So it's actually going to disappear even before it sets. And well, in this case, it didn't quite disappear, but you can see it's very, very thin as it's touching, getting down to the horizon. And here's another picture. So those are some nice pictures of the new moon. I can show you a picture that I took 2 months ago. Where'd it go? So if you look at this picture, can anybody spot the moon here? Feel free to unmute yourselves or raise your hands. Anybody see a new moon? So I don't see a new moon either because I didn't set the zoom correctly. But this picture that was taken a minute later, anybody see the new moon there? You can raise your hand or
Yes,
In the
right above the
peach.
arrow.
in the peach, right? Right. Okay, yeah, I gave you a hint because it's right over there, right? So you might get a sense of, yeah, you know, I guess this isn't really obvious if you were just walking around outside. You know, you might be looking up here, you might not be looking up at all. So, you know, you're not going to see this kind of moon by accident because again, you know, about 15 minutes later, the moon had set. So either you saw it or you didn't see it. You had to kind of be ready and you had to know that, hey, you know, is the moon going to be here? Is it going to be further south? Is it going to be further north? As the questions in the Gemara ask us. So that's the interesting part about seeing the new moon, or just to give you a visual as to what that looks like. And now I wanted to explain using some astronomy software on my little PC over here. I wanted to go through the monthly cycle of the moon to give you a better idea about, you know, why is it that the new moon is so hard to see? How is it that we only have a few minutes and the moon is always low when in fact, you know, when generally when we go out, if we're not trying to look for the first visibility, it's pretty easy to see the moon. So what's special about the very beginning of the month? So this is a piece of astronomy software. It's kind of like a planetarium you might have been in many years ago, but it's on our desktop. And it might be a little confusing for you at first. Actually, this month we have a bunch of bright planets that are outside. If anybody's been out, not too close to city lights, but Venus and Saturn and Jupiter are all out. And unless we zoom in, the moon kind of looks the same. But this is about what the moon looked like a few minutes after sunset a couple of days ago. This would have been a couple of days ago, right? So we get kind of a crescent as we saw in the picture. If we actually, let's go over to what the sky looks like. This is what the sky looks like right now outside my house or outside anybody in Israel's house. The sun has, what time is it? Yeah, the sun set about an hour ago. It's still a little bit bright out, especially since we're in the middle of a dust storm. So it's a little bit hazy out. And if we're looking over to the southwest, and there's bright Venus, and hey, where's the moon? Anybody know where the moon is? Well, I cheated a little bit because I have to zoom out. The picture before was from a few days ago, but as you all know, and as the Gemara explains, the moon goes around the earth once every 29 and a half days. So it actually moves a lot from day to day because it's got to go all the way around. So if the moon was near the horizon 5 days ago at this time, by today, it's gone up much higher. So you can see the moon over here where it used to be down in the southwest. Today, it's over here in the southeast. And that's where the moon is today. So now let me stretch the sky or make the sky a little bit smaller. And let's pretend that we're all lying down outside and we're kind of looking up at the sky. So if we look straight up at the sky, we get a view kind of like this, where the planets and the moon are kind of strung out from west to east. And again, we have to zoom into the moon to really see the phase nicely, but let's ignore the phase for a few minutes just so we can see the whole sky. Let me just interrupt for a second. If anybody is entirely lost, if you have any questions before I go on, feel free to speak up. Okay, so I'll assume this is what the sky looks like now. And now I'm going to try to move ahead by 1 day. Okay, so I'm going to change the picture of the sky from, this is what it looks like right now. You can see it's November 14th. And I'm going to change this now to be November 15th. So by tomorrow at the same time, as you can see, I'll just go back and forth. By tomorrow at the same time, the moon is going to jump ahead. Okay, every day the moon is going to move a little bit further to the east. Saying that a little bit different would be to say that the moon rises about an hour later every night. But since the moon is going around the earth, we expect that, yeah, every night if we go out and we look at the moon's going to keep moving. So tonight it's over here, tomorrow it will be there, the next night it will be there, the next night will be there, the next night will be there. And this is all at the same time of around 5:30. The next night it will be there, the next night it will be there. And hey, where'd the moon go? If we wait until the 20th at 5:30, the moon hasn't yet even risen. Okay, it's just off the screen. So we'll have to increase time a little bit. And if we wait a few more minutes, then the moon will rise. And then again, if we wait till the 21st, the moon again will be off the screen or not yet in the sky because it hasn't gotten to us yet. So again, if we increase the time from 5:30 to about 6:30, slowly, then about an hour later, the moon's going to rise again. Okay, and then if we just move a little bit forward, I'm going to change, well, actually here, right? If I change to the next day, I'll change to the next day, the 21st. And again, the moon's off the screen. So I'm going to have to increase the time by a few minutes until the moon rises. There we go, right? And then the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and then I'll have to wait again till the moon rises. So notice every day you see the time now is now 10 p.m. I'm using Israeli time over here, or European time. So every day the moon rises a little bit later and later. And then again, if we keep going to the next day, and then I have to wait another hour, and then the next day, whoops, and another hour, and I've totally lost where we are. I got to start over. Sorry about that. Okay, here we are at today again, and I'm just going to move ahead till like 3 in the morning, and then we'll move the calendar ahead to be 16, 17. Here comes the moon moving across the night sky. And now we're getting toward the end of the month. And if we take a look closely at the moon, then you'll see that at the end of the month, and now it's like 3:30 in the morning, the moon rises very late, around 3:30 in the morning. And if we zoom into the moon, we can see that it's also a small crescent, right? So at the beginning of the month, this moon started out as a crescent, then it moved to the first quarter, then it became full. And then as the month goes by and by, then the moon is getting smaller and smaller as we're getting farther in the Hebrew month. So again, not many of you have probably seen the moon in this position because you're probably not up at 3:30 in the morning looking up at the sky. But if you're out all night in the desert, or if you happen to go to work very early at the end of the month and you're pointed in the right direction, closer to the eastern sky, then you'll see the moon rising each night later and later, smaller and smaller. So here we are on November 30th, and the moon you can see is kind of small. Again, if we increase the calendar to be the next night, then you see the moon's a little bit smaller and it rises a little bit later. It's getting closer and closer to the horizon. And now let's go ahead to December 2nd. I'm sorry, yeah, to December 2nd and see what happens. So here we are at December 2nd, and the moon hasn't even risen yet at 3:30. So I'm going to move the time ahead a little bit. Couple of stars are going to rise, and here comes the moon. Okay, so here comes the moon, and you can see if we wait a little bit longer, afterwards, right soon after the moon rises, we're going to get sunrise. Okay, because we're getting close to the end of the lunar cycle, or the end of this Hebrew month. So just like at the beginning of the month where you can see the crescent for just a little while, at the end of the month, if you're up at 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning, then you can only see the crescent moon for a little while, because soon the sun comes up and then the sky is going to be brighter than the moon, where you're not going to be able to see the little crescent of the moon. Now, just to make this clear, I'm going to jump ahead to the next month, which would be Shvat. I'm going to go over to January 2nd, just to make this a little bit clearer. So again, if we go, okay, so let me just go back an hour. January 2nd, here we are in the morning. This is January 2nd, and we're looking for the moon. Okay, so this is actually the 30th day of the Hebrew month, and we're waiting for the moon to rise before the sun, but hey, there was no moon. Okay, notice that right now, the sun is so bright, okay? And in this program, because this is just a virtualization, you can kind of see this black circle over here, which is the moon. Can y'all see that? Where my mouse is? Okay, now, if you were out with your eyes or binoculars or a telescope, you wouldn't see anything here. Okay, there's no crescent over here. The program is just showing us that the moon is here. So this is what in the Gemara and Halacha is referred to as molad. This is when the sun and the moon are lined up. They're not lined up in 3 dimensions, so we don't have an eclipse, but they're lined up in 2 dimensions, excuse me, which means that the longitude of the sun and the longitude of the moon are the same, which means there isn't any angle between the sun and the moon to show a crescent. So as you saw, if you were up all night on January 2nd or the night before, you wouldn't see any moon. Just like the Gemara says, for 1 or 2 days every month, the moon is entirely visible. Doesn't matter what hour of the day you're out, or if you have a telescope, you're not going to see the moon, because the moon, the back of the moon is facing us, the dark side of the moon is facing us, the bright side of the moon is facing the sun. There's absolutely nothing to see. So there's no moon at all. And this is also what the Gemara talks about. Well, the similar case the month before, we saw, if the witnesses come and they said, we saw the moon in the morning and we saw it at night, the Gemara says that we don't listen to the witnesses, because the moon has to disappear for at least 24 hours. So if you saw it in the morning, that means the next day you won't be there. Or if you saw it at night, that means the previous day it wasn't there, because it would have been in this position right next to the sun. Okay, so this is the day when there's no moon. Now let's see what happens at the end of the day. So if we follow the sun over the course of the day, now we're on January 2nd, and we change the time. We let time move slowly forward. Let's see if we can get this right. Right, so the sun is slowly moving across the sky. It rises in the southeast. We'll zoom out for a minute. So now you can see the black moon, which again, you can't see because it's not lit up at all. And we speed up time a little more. So the sun keeps rising higher in the sky together with the moon. And now it passes the southern point. And you might notice the moon is moving a little bit to the left, because the moon's continuing in its orbit around the Earth. And it's almost getting close to the other side of the sun, but not quite. So here, whoops. I'm sorry, I pushed the wrong button. Let's go back to January. January 2nd. At sunset, right? So here we were at sunset a few minutes before, right? And so here you can see that the moon sets before the sun. Like, you know, the witnesses who said the moon sets before the sun doesn't count, because again, although in the program here we see a black moon, in the real world you can't see a black moon because it's completely dark. So if the witnesses went out on the 30th of the month at this night, they would say, hey, we stayed out all night long. We waited we waited for the moon, for the sun to set. And you can see here, as soon as the sun sets, there's obviously no moon, because the moon was right next to the sun. It actually set first. So what happens to now, what we need to do is we need to go out the next night and see if we can see the moon the next night. So let's go ahead and we'll just change the setting to be January 3rd. So here's the next night. Now, it's going to be tricky this night also. Okay, but here we go. The sun is setting. It's getting a little bit darker. Can anybody see a moon? Okay, the program helps you there because it puts up the label. Okay, but now you can, let's zoom in a little bit. So on this night, it's actually going to be very difficult to see the moon because you can kind of see just a tiny bit of white on the right side of the moon facing the sun, where my mouse is pointing to. But you see that the moon is very low. So if the sun sets around 5 p.m. on this day, we'll see that in a few minutes later, right, by about 5:20, the moon sets. So it means that on January 3rd, if you were out and you were watching very carefully, and if there were no clouds, and you were looking exactly in the right direction, which in this case will be west by southwest, if you happen to be looking just at the right place, you only had a 20-minute window where you might see the moon. But again, because the moon was only, we can actually get some data over here. If we click on it, it will show you over here that the illumination of the moon is only 1.1%. Okay, so there was just a tiny, tiny sliver of the moon was visible. So most likely witnesses wouldn't be able to see the moon on that night. Okay, but if we come back the next day, let's set the clock back a little bit earlier. We come back at 5 p.m. and we go to the next night. So the next night, you can see here that after sunset, the moon is relatively high up. And now you can see more clearly, if we zoom in, there's a nice white crescent on the edge because now it's far enough from the sun where a little bit of the moon is facing us. And now also you can see, again, if we zoom back out, that you've also got, at this point, the sky is not very dark, so it might be still a little bit harder to see the moon. But if we let the clock tick forward, as it gets darker, you can see now we've got like more than an hour after sunset when the moon is still above the horizon. And by this time, anybody who's outside who's looking west is going to see the moon to be obvious. But I didn't do the exact calculation, but probably by this day, it's the 31st day after the previous new moon. So Betin would have counted it as the first of the month anyways, right? We only need witnesses on the night of the 30th because that's the only suffix. By the next day, we know that since the moon on average is either 29 or 30 days, we would never need witnesses for this night. But this night, you would see that it's very easy to find a new moon. But the previous night, when we did need witnesses, as you saw, it would have been very hard to find the moon. Okay, so I think that's it for my demo. Unless there's any questions, I'll hand the microphone or Zoom back to who's ever next.
All right, Tom, thank you very much. I almost feel like we should have had you speak as an introduction before we did this Masechet. This was very interesting. If anybody has any
7 more years.
Yeah, please feel free to put them in the chat if there are any specific questions. So I guess I have a question, which is the one that you just showed now. So there will be months, I guess, where you won't be able to basically see the new moon, and the Beit Din would sort of just have to declare it anyways, because it would just be the 31st day.
Correct, right. If the, depending on the synchronization between the moon and your local sunset, and in my case, I was showing you for Jerusalem where it matters. So you have to have it where like the moon's far enough from the sun to be bright enough, and it has to be, where it's far enough from the sun and near sunset in Jerusalem. So there's definitely months when the witnesses can't possibly see it, which is why you'll have a 30-day month. And then the next day, that didn't always, even without announcing it, the next day, you can never have a month that's 31 days, so it automatically becomes Rosh Chodesh the next day. Similarly, even if you could see the moon, sometimes it's cloudy. In my program, it's never cloudy, so I could always see it. But even if the moon is, easily visible, especially in the winter months, if it's cloudy near the horizon and, for an hour after sunset, nobody's going to see the moon either.
So, right. So in other words, you always have perfect weather. Somebody asked here, Ed asked, where can we get this software?
If I can find the chat, this is actually, there's a website. You can download this for free, and they now have a version on the website that you don't even have to download. It's called Stellarium. Let me find that for you real quick, and I'll pass on the link.
Okay, so the website is Solarium, and Tom's going to try to put it in our chat.
Okay.
Okay, we have another question here from Beth. Is there a difference in seasons when it's easier or harder to see the moon? Beth, I was thinking the same question. Or is it just depending on how cloudy it is?
Well, I think, I guess the short answer is, yeah, it depends. If it's clear, the main thing is that you want clear weather. So that generally means, you know, summertime versus wintertime when it's cloudy here in Israel. The other thing is that you can kind of tell from, it's a little bit hard to tell from the program, but I'll just demonstrate with my hand. Depending on the season, the angle, you know, since Jerusalem and probably all your listeners, we all live in the Northern Hemisphere. When you're looking at the horizon, the sun is setting at an angle and the moon's following it at an angle. So one of the features that makes the moon easy to see is when it's far from the sun. But far from the sun is at this angle. So when it's setting sideways, this is going to get a little bit complicated, but basically what happens is if the angle is very shallow, that means that the sun versus the sun is like barely set before the moon gets to set, which means that it's not going to be very dark. Whereas like when you're close to the spring and fall here in the Northern Hemisphere, then the angle that the sun and the moon make are a little bit higher, or a little bit straighter, which means that you generally have more time between sunset and moonset, which makes it a little bit easier. So there is several.
So basically in the winter, there was a very short period of time that ADIM could see it. In other words, between cloudy and the angle.
Correct.
It may have been very difficult to be seen.
Right.
And what's the difference with the Southern Hemisphere?
Well, the Southern Hemisphere, the angle would just be different because they'd be looking, you know, the moon would be going, it's hard for me to describe, but the seasons would still be the same. It would be easier to see in the spring and fall versus the winter.
Versus the winter. Okay,
I'm
great.
sorry, what they would call winter.
What they would call their winter, right? Everyone's winter, it's harder to see.
Right.
Does anybody have any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate you joining us. Someone just commented here, witnesses needed to be nearly as expert as rabbis to know which 20-minute window to look for the moon and in which direction. I think that is probably true, Ed, that they're probably, and I wondered that too, like if there was a group of people who sort of were more expert in looking for the moon than other people.
Right. I mean, there's a whole interesting sugya with the Gemara, or, you know, some modern commentators on the Gemara, in the sense of, you know, in the case when the moon is easy to see, which happens on some months when it happens to be a large distance between the moon and the sun on the 30th, then you don't need to be an expert at it, because almost anybody that looks basically to the west and waits for the sun to set, as we said, if you have an hour, if you look to the west, you'll see it. And versus those months when it's difficult to see, then you really have to be looking. So either way, it seems like, you know, Bet Din should have had expert witnesses, you know, that would just stand on the roof in Yerushalayim. And then the question is, you know, why the Gemara goes to great lengths, and, you know, you can be Machal Shabbat if the witnesses come. So there's all kinds of, you know, I don't have time to go into it, and I don't have any good answers, but there's certainly like this issue of, like, you know, when it's easy, it's really easy, and then you wouldn't need to wait for somebody to come on Shabbat. And when it's hard, then it would have been really hard, and you would have kind of needed an expert. You wouldn't just wait for some random person to come tell you. So it's definitely an issue that needs more digging.
Thank you. So I'll just end with one final comment here from Beth. The ease of seeing the moon, is that related to our important fall and spring holidays? Was it easier to see the moon, let's say for Rosh Chodesh Tishrei and Rosh Chodesh Nisan, as opposed to other months?
Well, I mentioned, you know, because you or somebody asked about the seasons, the season is one factor, but the more important factor is, you know, just the distance between the sun and the moon, or the angle between the sun and the moon at the end of the 30th day, and if it coincides with sunset by you. So I don't think that I think there's, you know, other better reasons for why the holidays are in those months, unrelated to the moon. And remember that regardless, whether we use the shita that was used in the time of the Mishnah, of having witnesses, or we used our modern technique of having of a calculated calendar. Either way, Bet Din knew what the rules were. If witnesses didn't come on the 30th, then the 31st was Rosh Chodesh. So either way, we didn't have any issues with the holidays coming in the middle of the month. The only issue the Gemara talks about is, when you have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when you only have, 0 days or 10 days, that became more of an issue. But by the 15th of the month, certainly for Israel and Yerushalayim, there was never any question about when the month started and when the Chagim start.
All right, thank you very, very much. Tom, if you could just stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
And we really appreciate you being here and hope you'll have an opportunity to learn with us again. Thank you very much. And with that, we are going to end our Masechet. So Anne, I'm going to hand it over to you to learn the end of this Masechet with us.
I just want to say also my personal thank you to Tom. I think that I finally understand truly in a whole new light the issues of the witnesses and why it was such a big deal for, why sometimes there would be a whole slew coming and sometimes it would be hard to get anybody to come. So I think that's very helpful. I also want to just comment on the Masechet as a whole. I would say that, Yordana, you commented on the chat that I think a number of people have found this Masechet to be emotional. And I think that the part
Especially
of why,
after Beitzah.
but part of it, I think, is that, first of all, it's familiar, perhaps more familiar topics. Certainly the holidays are more familiar, but I think that it touches on, the calendar and prayer, and you put those two together. And I think people have, everybody's got some kind of personal dynamic with both of those things. So we're gonna, there's much more to say. There's always more to say, but we're already in Ta'anit in the daily stuff. So we're going to finish the daf now. Yordana, you're going to say the Hadran. I'm going to learn here just the final daf, which you'll all recall is a short daf. I'm going to go through it quite quickly. Kislek Rabbi Abba Mimei Persha. So Rabbi Abba returned from his travels. He was at sea. Modim Chachamim l'Rabban Gamliel bebrachot shel Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom Kippurim v'halacha miklal deplige bebrachot d'chol Hashanah. So the sages all agreed with the opinion of Rabban Gamliel that the blessings of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur would be as they were set to, this is a continuation of the previous daf. And so then Rav Yochanan's statement about the halacha says that it's in accord with Rabban Gamliel, which means that even though the Tanaim were still disagreeing about the blessings of the entire year, they're siding, just practically speaking, with Rabban Gamliel. And then the Gemara wants to, of course, raise a difficulty. Ini, is that so? V'hama Rabbi Chana Tzipor Ra'a, Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha k'Rabban Gamliel bebrachot Rosh Hashanah v'shel Yom Kippurim. Is it so? Isn't it the case that Rabbi Chana from Tzipori said, that Rabbi Yochanan said that the halacha is in accordance with Rabban Gamliel when it comes to the blessings of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, meaning is, this question of were they still having a dispute or not with regard to what the blessings should be it's a funny thing because it's not the debate about the blessings. It's a question of whether the debate was being upheld. Ella Amar Nachman Bar Yitzchak Man Modim Rabbi Meir V'halacha Miklal Deplige Rabbanan. So rather, Rabbi Yochanan's statements need to be taken as being referring to other rabbis, as Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, specifically who's agreeing with Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Meir, and then with regards to Rabbi Yochanan, that the halacha is in accord with Rabbi Gamliel. Then we can understand that in fact the Tanaim do still disagree, and that means the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir, which means that they also disagree with Rabbi Gamliel. The Tanya, so the Gemara then brings a Braita. So for the blessings of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the Shliach Tzibor, the Chazan, will fulfill the obligation on behalf of the community. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's Rabbi Meir's position. V'chachamim omrim kishem Shliach Tzibor chayav, kach kol yachid v'yachid chayav. And the rabbis, meaning this is the other side of the debate, say that just as the Shliach Tzibor was obligated to in these prayers, so each and every individual is obligated in the prayers and therefore needs to recite them. A person needs to recite them on his own. Excuse me, that's enough. Sorry, there's some noise in my background here. Which means then that Rabbi Meir agrees with Rabban Gamliel. specifically with regard to the blessings of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and Rabbanan dispute and say that each person needs to daven on their own. The Gemara says, well, what's different specifically about Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur that Rabbi Meir is going to agree to Rabban Gamliel, but not about all the other blessings? Ilema mishum dinefishe cry Rav Chananel Amarav. So what happens? He says, if we're only talking about here nefishe cry, there's many different verses that are included in these blessings. So is that the point, that they're more difficult and therefore the Shliach Tzibor's role becomes more important? So didn't Rav Chananel say that Rav said that once you've said the quote, it is written in your Torah, then it is no longer necessary to recite all of the verses themselves, as long as you've acknowledged that that's where the prayer is coming from. But rather it's because there's so many blessings. So it's not because that they're from verses, it's that there's many of them and they are long, which means that not everybody can learn them off by heart. That is certainly, we talked about this on the podcast, and certainly I think we can all relate to that the prayer of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the prayers of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur are particularly long. Gufa Amar Rab Chananel Amar Rav, Kivan Shamar v'Toratcha Katuv Leimor, Shuv Eino Tzarich. So then Rabbi Chananel says, the Rav says that once you've said that same line, you don't have to say it again. You don't have to recite the blessings again. So then the Gemara is going to clarify that that's specifically when we're talking about a yachid, an individual who's praying on his own or her own. But if we're talking about the congregation, then that would not be the case. Itamar. Amr Yeshua ben Levi, Achad Yachiv, Achad Tzibur, Kivan Shamar, v'Torah Katuv Lemor, Shuvei No Tzarich. And then Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, no, we don't draw this distinction between the individual and the congregation. Rather, we just say, once you've said, v'Torah Katuv Lemor, that same line, then you no longer have to recite all of the verses, which, by the way, would change everybody's tefillah, dramatically on Rosh Hashanah. Amr Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says, a person should arrange his prayer. He should organize his prayer beforehand and then afterwards pray. Amar Rabbi Abba Misabra Milta de Rabbi Elazar bebrachot shel Rosh Hashanah shel Yom Kippurim b'shel Prakim aval dechol Hashanah lo. So then we understand Rabbi Abba says that what Rabbi Elazar says here makes sense when we're talking specifically about the brachot of Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, but for the tefillot that, because they're recited, sporadically, not very frequently, but when we're talking about tefillot that are all year long, meaning that are recited much more frequently, then that is not necessary to say, meaning you don't have to have this preparation in advance. Ini, and the Gemara says, like we saw before, Ini, is it so? Vaha Rav Yehuda didn't Rabbi Yehuda first organize his tefillot in his mind and only then pray, even on a regular day? Shani Rabbi Yehuda mitlatin yomin letiltin yomin havamatli kiprakim dami. Rabbi Yehuda was different because he would pray really only every 30 days to begin with, so it was like intermittent prayer. Amar of Achabar Avira, Amar Bishimon Chasida, Poter Haya Rabban Gamliel, Afilu Im Shebesadot, Afilu Am Shebesadot, Velomi Bai Hani Dekai Mahacha. So Rav Achabar Avira said that Rabbi Shimon Chasida said that Rabban Gamliel would let the Shliach Tzibor daven and exempt the people who were in the field, meaning they're not even in the room, that they would fulfill their obligation of prayer through the Shliach Tzibor who's over there in the synagogue. And then the question is, what about the people who are here, right? Can't he exempt those local people as well? Adrabah, the Gemara asks a question here. No, to the contrary, it says it makes more sense. It makes more sense to say that he's not going to fulfill the obligation of the people who were in the synagogue, but rather the people who are out in the fields, because those are the people who can't really manage to do the davening on their own as individuals, as opposed to the people who are local and they can do their own tefillah. Ditani Abba Bered Rav Binyamin Barchia Shachorei Koranim Einan Bichlal Bracha. So as Abba, the son of Binyamin Barchia, teaches, there's a braita here that the people would be behind the Kohanim, and they were not included in the bracha. We talked about this on the podcast, the physical location of where people stand with regard to Birkat Kohanim. Ela ki ata Rabin Amar Rav Yaakov Bar Idi Amar Rav Shimon Chasida Lo Patar Rabbi Gamliel Ela Am Shebesadot. So rather, we need to understand Rabbi Gamliel's statement a little bit differently. When Ravin came from the land of Israel to Bavel, to Babylonia, he speaks to Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, and he says that Rabbi Shimon Bar Chasida said that Rabbi Gamliel would allow the people, the Shlech Tzibur, to fulfill the obligation of the people who were davening who were in the fields and therefore not able to daven on their own. And what was the reason? My Tama. Because they were prevented, they were forced, they were prevented to come daven because of their work circumstances. But had they been in the city, they would not have been exempted. They would have needed to do their own tefillah. Hadran alach Yom Tov v'slikela Masechet Rosh Hashanah. Nardeta, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. And with that, we'll say the Hadran alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah, v'Hadran alach Datan alach Masechet Rosh Hashanah, v'Datan alach. Lo nishne minach Masechet Rosh Hashanah v'lo nishe minan lo ba'alma hadim v'lo ba'alma datei. Yehi ratzon v'fanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei avotenu shetehei toratacha emunatenu v'olam hazeh utehei imanu le'olam haba. Chanini bar papa, Rami bar papa, Nachman bar papa, Achai bar papa, Abai Mari bar papa, Rafram bar papa, Rachish bar papa, Surcha bar papa, Ada bar papa, Dara bar papa. Harab na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratacha b'finu v'fiyot amcha be'Yisrael v'hana anachnu v'tzatzainu v'tzatzaei amcha be'Yisrael kulani yodei shemecha v'lamdei toratacha lishma me'yavai timcheni mitzvotacha ki olam hili yehi libi tamim b'chukacha l'man lo evosh li'olam lo eshkach b'kudecha ki vam chitani baruch ata Adonai lamdeni chukacha amen 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 sela v'ad modim anachnu lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei avotenu shesamta cholkenu miyosvei beit hamidrash v'lo samta cholkenu miyosvei karniyot. She'anu mashkimim v'hei mashkimim. Anu mashkimim lidvrei Torah v'hei mashkimim lidvrei b'telim. Anu amelim v'hei amelim. Anu amelim mekablim schar v'hei amelim v'einam mekablim schar. Anu ratzim v'hei ratzim. Anu ratzim l'chayei olam haba v'hei ratzim lever shachad. She'nemar v'ata Elohim toridem lever shachad. Anshei damim emirma lo yechatzu yimehem v'ani avtach bach. Yehi ratzon lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu kashem she'azartanu l'sayim Masechet Rosh Hashanah Kain ta'azreinu lahatchil masachtot usfarim acharim l'samam l'mod u'lelamed lishmor v'lasod l'kayem kol divrei Talmud Toratacha bi'ava u'zechut kol hatanayim v'hamorim v'talmidei chachamim yamod lanu u'lezarenu shelo tamush hatara mipinu u'mipi zarenu v'zera zarenu adolam v'titkayem banu v'hilchalecha taneach otach v'shiflecha tishmor alecha v'haktsiota hi tisacha kivi yerbu yamecha v'yosifu lecha shnot chayim orech yamim b'yamina u'smol osher v'chavod Adonai oz li'amo yitain Adonai yivarech et amo b'shalom. Mazel tov, everybody, and we will see you back here in about 4 weeks. So already get thinking about what it is that you want to share with us. Looking forward to seeing all of you soon. Feel free to take off your mute button if you want to say a quick hello or just put something in the chat, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you all for joining us every day.
Oh, and until tomorrow, go and learn.
Go and learn.